Hi, today I will be talking about the haze issue and I will be focusing on the main issues of this topic while not giving too many details at the moment because all the details will be provided by my group mates next Thursday. And as such, this assessment just serves to highlight how much my understanding is about the issue. Now, we are talking about the haze, which has been going on for a long time, and it is not going to end anytime soon. Now, I'll be covering some of the main points here that why is it that it has been going on for a long time and its continuation even until today, the current efforts that have already been done, some of the things that are lacking, and what can be improved. Now, obviously, the last part of the presentation is probably the most important one. Now, when we look at the historical background, the haze has been going on for six, about perhaps 30 to 40 years now. And the reason why is because of the global palm oil industry. Now, this has exacerbated recently, especially because of the fact that our region has harnessed or has capitalized on the global palm oil industry to get revenue. Now, unlike Singapore, which is a knowledge based economy, Indonesia actually still relies heavily on agriculture, and as a result, it uh, felt the need to capitalize on this very global lucrative industry. And it has been starting plantations ever since about the 1990s after Suharto's reign collapsed after the Asian financial crisis. Now, in this sense, um, there are a few issues that I want to talk about today. And the first one is that while we want to understand the haze, the physical aspect of the problem is of essential to be understood. Now, when I say physical, this means that Indonesia's lands consist a lot of peatlands. And if I'm not mistaken, about 86% of the land in Indonesia is covered with this flammable material. And as a result, it renders the land very vulnerable to fire in the first place. And so not only is it weather conditions such as the El Nino, which exacerbated the haze last year, but it's also because of the geographical conditions of the country that has rendered it vulnerable to the haze. And the second issue that I will be talking about is related to behavior. Now, not all palm oil plantations actually are on fire and are vulnerable to it because that completely depends on the company that manages it and also the behavior of the people. Now, Indonesia has been known for swidden agriculture and also for traditional burning practices. But because in the past, when a lot of the smallholders were given about 2 to 3 hectares of land, they could still manage the fire very well. And as a result, it was a lot easier to contain the fire, also because the villagers lived near their own plantations. And as a result, while the behavioral problems might be seen as a external threat in terms of SWOT analysis, this does not actually constitute the main crux of the problem of the haze issue. Now, when it comes to burning, this is exacerbated because of the land conflict that arose because of not only companies' intervention to the matter, but also because of decentralization. Now, what do I mean by this? Ever since the transmigration program was conducted after Suharto's reign collapsed, this posed a lot of problems in terms of land conflict because the transmigrants were allocated a certain amount of land and they managed to actually land grab certain lands that were supposed to be customary to a lot of the indigenous population in Sumatra and in Kalimantan, where the haze mainly originated from. And as a result, the locals felt that they were stripped of their rights and um, used arson instead to make a point that they own the land instead of these transmigrants and also the companies. And therefore, there have existed a lot of land conflicts that further exacerbated the vulnerability of the land to the haze because land might be seen as a point of conflict in terms of getting resources and not only in terms of um, getting lucrative revenue out of it. And as a result, we also need to look at how the palm oil plantations that are mature are less likely to be on fire and cause the haze precisely because the companies have a vested interest in ensuring that they are not on fire. In contrast, plantations that are just going to be replanted, will be more vulnerable because the land will be cleared, and as a result, companies may see like fire as a, despite being unsustainable, but it's the most cost-effective way in order to clear the land. Now, moving on to the role of ASEAN. Well, we look at Singapore and we look at ASEAN as a whole, as a region. Well, Singapore has been doing a lot of efforts, and it also utilizes ASEAN, such as the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act, and also helping Indonesia in times of need. However, the problem with this approach is that Singapore is seen to be a hero in this issue, and Indonesia does not want anybody to bypass its sovereignty. Now, this means that even ASEAN is unable to do much in the process, because a lot of the measures that have been taken have been very limited, not only because of internal politics and patronage relations that promote corruption and the government's own involvement in the haze issue, and also their inability to mitigate the issue, but it's also because Singapore's approach has not been very favorable in Indonesian eyes because of its problem on sovereignty. Furthermore, ASEAN has been deemed as weak because of the fact that the ASEAN way operates under such notions of protecting Indonesia's sovereignty and also other member states. And as a result, Singapore finds it really difficult to not be confrontational in its approach, because it has always been technical in handling the haze issue. Now, moving on forward, while I have talked a bit about the issues at hand, I also want to summarize some of the main solutions that our task force group has already compiled. Now, with regards to NGOs, which I didn't highlight too much earlier on, they have been doing a great job in terms of distributing masks to the public, but when it comes to their relationships with companies, they have been very limited in terms of their effectiveness. And as a result, also in terms of bypassing the sovereignty issue, we propose that the Singapore government actually trains trainers in Singapore to train the NGOs in Indonesia to do community-based mapping. And this can also be achieved by using available tools online, which is the Hotspot Open Map program that is endorsed by the UN. Now, this community-based mapping is very important because it not only bypasses the issue of sovereignty, but it also allows relevant Indonesian actors to gain access to the map, so that it's much easier for them to gain access to the hotspot, so that it is easy to prevent the haze issue by better monitoring of the hotspots. Because currently there have been very limited efforts at doing this, and there has to be more monitoring of PSI levels even within the land itself, within the plantations themselves. Now, secondly, what Singapore can do is that it needs to recognize its role in the supply chain. Now, Spring Singapore, as a provider of grants, can provide ESG, which is environmental and social governance guidelines in the finance industry, not only in terms of the types of grants that it provides to Singapore, to small and medium enterprises or SMEs, and therefore it needs to require SMEs to have a sustainability framework, so that they do not engage with suppliers who are not RSPO certified. Now, what is RSPO? This certification actually ensures that there is a form of international standard that smallholders abide to, in order to ensure that Singapore does not actually contribute to the haze. Now, this RSPO certification is at least a first step in ensuring that smallholders abide by this rule. It may not be the most perfect solution, because it does not have zero peatlands and deforestation, but at least it's a first step in ensuring that all smallholders abide by a certain standard first, and then later we can work on further arrangements. Now, with regards to the finance industry, the Singapore Association of Banks have actually issued a guideline to ensure that all banks operating in Singapore will operate by the ESG standards. However, even though international banks such as Standard Chartered have already abided by this, other Singaporean banks such as DBS have not actually abided by this and are given time until 2017. Now, this is understandable given the amount of time that is needed to do restructuring in terms of organization and also in terms of the types of assessment, risk assessment, and also the types of partnerships that it wants to establish. It has to better um, monitor the kind of partnerships it has with external suppliers and also external companies whenever it wants to provide grants or loans. And as a result, we believe that this will take place earlier, probably in 2017, where the guideline is expected to lapse. Now, hopefully that Singapore banks can actually see the need to do this because it wants to make sure that it is clean in the supply chain and does not contribute to the furthering of the exacerbation of the haze. Now, moreover, we also need to incorporate more education into our secondary school and primary school system, in which we utilize the facts about the haze and the role of Singaporeans in the haze problem, and not only blaming Indonesia for the matter. Now, the syllabus for social studies have recently been changed to fit the Little India issue and also current affairs issues. So education is a very good platform through social studies or through geography in order to educate young Singaporeans about their role in ethical consumption and also sustainable consumption. Now, when it comes to NGOs, again, the Singapore government can not only do the community-based mapping, but also can give more support to NGOs and ensure that there are more dialogues that the Singapore government endorses and support in terms of this issue, because NGOs themselves need a lot of funding, and therefore the government can always use the NGOs in Singapore in order to conduct partnerships with Indonesian NGOs, so that the issue of sovereignty is again not an issue for the Indonesian government. And therefore, the Indonesian NGOs are better able to conduct their programs and socialize the community, not to do burning practices, and also to have more sense of ownership over their land, even though they may not own the land anymore. Now, when it comes to bilateral collaboration, Singapore also needs to change its approach with regards to the haze issue with Indonesia, because it has always been, again, looking at this issue in a technical manner. And as I have previously mentioned, it needs to further soften its approach and further collaborate in terms of managing the haze issue. While it has already collaborated with Jambi in 2007, 2008, it has already lapsed, and it needs to further enhance this partnership so that there are more partnerships, especially during the dry season the when the Indonesian land is, and weather especially, is currently, it will be extremely vulnerable to fire because of the dry season, and as a result, this collaboration is of essence. Now, when it comes to the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act, this is extremely important because there have already been guidelines and Indonesia has already ratified it. While we recognize that collaboration with ASEAN is a very long-term issue that will have a lot of time lag, this is still a very important measure that we need to take in order to ensure that Indonesia recognizes its role in the haze issue, and that it will declare haze as a national disaster, which it is considering to do, and therefore it will make sure that it deals with the issue at hand in a more serious manner rather than focusing on its current patronage politics. Now, I have given a brief account as to what kind of issues and what kind of solutions we have in terms of the haze issue, and I hope that the oral defense that my group mates will be presenting next Thursday will be much more in depth and much more elaborate. And with that, I thank you for listening.